morning.
It was just another reminder of the differences in different Dharma centers. I remember those words from that chant because my first center was Zen Center of Pittsburgh, where Kyoki taught. She was my first teacher. But since then, I've spent the vast majority of my time at a center in San Francisco Zen Center or one of their centers. And they're different words. So I was trying to follow along without looking and thinking, yeah, you're going to have to look at this one next time. Can't get away with it. So if you don't know already, my name's Carol Dougherty. My Dharma name is Kanshin Kijaku. When you address me, though, just call me Carol. You can also call me Doc. It's sort of a family nickname, but mostly only writing workshop people call me that. But I answer to both of them. And this is a way-seeking mind talk. So you probably all know what that is, but just in case you don't, or in case anybody on Zoom doesn't, it's basically how I got here, how I got involved in Zen. And I'll do a little bit of the Dickens approach and start with how I grew up, only to give you a context, but I won't spend too much time there. So I was born in 1955. Eisenhower was the president. I don't remember him. I knew he was bald. I remember that from growing up. And they called him Ike, but that was pretty much it. My parents were Kennedy Democrats, not necessarily right then, but that was a major factor in our lives because it means A, they were Catholic, and therefore so were we, and B, they supported John Kennedy and were liberals in their youth, which they were pretty young when we were born. So, and those things all played a big part in my life and my growing up. I was one of those kids who loved being Catholic. I know that's probably not something you've heard often, but I hung out with nuns and priests. I liked them. You know, they were all different, but I loved every teacher I had. Well, some more than others, of course, but and the priests were really, you're a little kid. You see this priest who walks into your classroom and, he's like the representative of God. And so, that's pretty cool. But they were interesting people in and of themselves. And I appreciated that. And we were, I have to say it because unfortunately it has to be said, we were very lucky that we lived in a parish that when a lot of Pennsylvania had a lot of charges. This was in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, against the clergy. And lists in the newspaper like you wouldn't believe. And the church that I grew up in had none. Not a single charge against any one of those priests in all those years. And I just think, wow, the odds of that. We were so lucky to be in that parish with those priests at that time. And I think a lot of it had to do with the guy who was the Monsignor. And I'll give you an example of his behavior because I'm very fond of my memory of him. It was Monsignor Thomas Henninger. And, he wasn't the cool one because he was older, he was bald, he was the Monsignor. I mean, the young priests were the cool ones because, they were the ones who came visiting in the classroom and they did most of the masses that we went to when we were in school. But I went knocking on the door at the rectory one day, looking for entertainment from the priests, because I would just go in and hang out and talk to them. I mean, second grade, I don't know what I was thinking, but I started early. My mother said that I used to go next door to our neighbors when I was 1.5 years and sit there while she had her morning coffee, Mrs. Daly on Simplin Street. But anyway, the housekeeper answered. That was in the days when they still had a housekeeper, and the Monsignor was there, but none of the other priests were there, Father Lidovec and Father Boyle. I still remember them very well. And so he invited me in. And whatever work he was doing, he put it down. He invited me in, had the housekeeper bring me a cookie, and then took me into the parlor and sat me down on the sofa, and he went over and sat down and played the piano for me and gave me a little recital. And I just sat there, and I was having such a good time with my cookie and listening to him play the piano. And I look back on that and I think, wow, that was amazing. And I think, yeah, so much of my life has been like that. I've had opportunities and I've had experiences. And so I didn't come to Zen because I hated the Catholic Church. But I did walk away from it when I was older. There were a lot of things I loved about it, and when I was in second grade, Pope John the 23rd had the Second Ecumenical Council. That's when it started. Happened to start on my birthday, October 11th. So I kind of took possession of the whole thing. It was my ecumenical council. I mean, he was important too, but it was mine. And it changed a lot of things in the church. Some that were very upsetting for people, some that, I think made it a better, more inclusive church. And then he died before his work was done. And the next conclave elected Pope Paul VI, and he promised to do the same things, and he did, pretty much. But it was still a shock, because within that same year, John Kennedy was assassinated. So for people like my parents, and for kids like us, the secular leader of the country was killed, and the religious leader of our church died, and our church was in change. So it kind of took the foundation out from underneath everybody. I didn't realize how important that was really until I was in my 50s and at Naropa getting a Master of Divinity, and I was doing a family systems class, and we wrote about our family systems. And one of the things that I learned was those were difficult years for Catholics, and especially Democratic Catholics, which were a lot of them. And I don't begin to understand exactly how that affected my parents, except that I can look back now and see that a lot of things that affected me came from their response to that. They got very conservative pretty quickly. And it was mostly out of fear. And I understand that. I mean, we all have fear, I live with it every day, But I have learned not to let it stop me from doing what I think I need to do. So fast forward till I was out of college and I was working. And I was working in University of Pittsburgh Theater Department. And I was still going to Mass most Sundays until this one Sunday. I was at a church in Shadyside, and this priest got up there. And he started talking about the evils of homosexuals and how they were worse than murderers. And I worked in the theater. I was, to some extent, aware of my own queerness then, but not completely. I certainly wasn't out in any way, shape, or form. But I was working with a lot of people, and at that point, one of my first grade classmates had already died of AIDS. And I wanted to stand up and say, "You are full of shit," to this priest. I didn't. Because the church I was in, friends of my parents, friends of mine, went there. And there's a pretty good chance they were at that Mass because they liked to go out on Saturday night and it was the late Mass. And I'm like, oh yeah, I don't want Jerry and Seal to see me do this. You know, that'll just upset Mom and Dad when they hear about it. And also, there was a part of me that I didn't respect that man who gave that sermon. But I respected his role as a priest in the Catholic Church. So I got up and walked out. And I was close enough. He saw it. I was happy about that. And I'll be honest, you know, I've thought about that many a time, but it wasn't until recently when a friend of mine wrote something on Substack, it made me realize that I hadn't quite resolved how I felt about that, because part of me says you should have stood up. You should have said this isn't okay. And I didn't. And that hit me really hard all these years later, to think that, wow, I had good reasons for not doing it, but they were crap too. But I didn't do it, and I can't go back and change it. But even after all these years, I'm glad I know that if I could, I would do it differently. So, needless to say, I stopped going to church. I wasn't going to sit through any more of that. I never stopped loving the church that I grew up in, which was pretty great for me, not so great for a lot of other people. And I got into a lot of different things, including writing. And I had a wonderful writing teacher, Gary Provo, who taught me a lot about trying to write a novel, and taught me a lot about humility in the process. And unfortunately, I only knew Gary a few years before he died. But before he died, we had one day of hanging out together, and we were watching the Kentucky Derby. He was in Pittsburgh for a writing thing, and we were watching that and talking about writing, and he just out of the blue said, you know, I really think you should go study with Natalie Goldberg, you know, who wrote Writing Down the Bones and Wild Mind. He said, she can teach you some things that I can't teach you. Her process is something you need, because I had a lot of trouble writing emotional things. And I said, well, you know, okay, but I really can't afford to do both. Maybe I'll buy the book. And I did. And 3 days later, he died. And it took me a couple years before I went to hear Nat. she came near to Pittsburgh because most of her workshops were in New Mexico. She was in Ohio, Antioch, Ohio, and she was the guest, I guess the keynote speaker, and she did one of the tracks every morning for a week, speaking on writing. And that was where I was introduced to writing as a Zen practice and meditation. And I had a doctor who tried to get me to meditate before then because of stress. And my cat and dog found a lot of amusement in that process. They just would sit there and stare at me like, what are you doing? But when I went into that classroom and Nat said, we're just going to meditate for a couple minutes just so you have a feel for it. And she gave us meditation instruction. And we sat there, and I was like, this is meditation. This is great. And I knew everything had just changed. And during that whole week, you know, I went to everything that she taught. There was one night where they did a group thing. I don't know, 5 or 6 people were up on the stage, and the rest of us, I think it was like 150 people, were all sitting in the audience. But while they were getting ready, you know, I went in early, got a good seat, so I got to watch the show. And it was a show because people were bustling across the stage and around the place. And I mean, you know those events. Everybody wants... The thing is, everybody is important. I mean, people have to get the sound system right. They have to get the setup right. They have to make sure the people who are supposed to be there are there. You know, there's a lot of work that has to be done, but then there's also a lot of extra from especially the people in the audience, but even some of the people on the stage who are aware of everybody watching them, except for Nat. She was sitting in a chair like this, and she just sat there like a rock. And she didn't move. She was just present. And I was up in the peanut gallery, and I sat up there and I watched her, and I'd look around at all these other people, and I'd look at her and I'd think, I want to do that. I want to be able to do that. I didn't know how. And the last day when everybody said their goodbyes, I went up to her and I said, I had a lot of questions this week, but the problem is they were all about meditation and not about writing. So I didn't think they were really appropriate in the class. And she just nodded her head and she said, come and study with me in Taos. And in my mind I'm thinking, yeah, who's going to pay for that? But I did actually make it a priority. You know, I wasn't going to any other workshops at that point. So the money I would have spent on those, I put away for going to Taos, and ended up, because of some things Nat said during that week, going to Clouds and Water for my first 3-day sesshin with no preparation. I mean, none. My sitting had been in chairs, in Taos, a little bit at a time, you know. I was not at all prepared for the rigor, shall we say, of a 3-day sesshin where they didn't care how experienced you were. You just sat. And I will say, I sat every single period. Almost killed me, but I did it. And I got to have a meeting with Dosho Port, who was leading the sesshin, And he said, well, you know, there's this teacher coming to Pittsburgh who's opening a Zen center. And I said, really? Who? And she's in the Katagiri tradition. And I said, who's that? Kyoki Roberts, you know. And he gave me her number and said, call her. So I did. And there were a group of us. She was just getting ready to open. So we did a couple of work days, and, you know, we got to know her. And that was my introduction to doing things every day, practicing every day. And it was amazing. She was a great teacher, you know. I think she was so excited to have people to teach, like, the forms and all of it, because, you know, she was on her own for the first time. You know, she'd been here with Nonan, and this was her Zen center that she was running. And that it was run very much like this, but there is something different about being the one responsible for everything. And you could see, you know, she was like as happy as a clam, because she was doing what she wanted to do, and she had people who were interested in it, and she had a place where her two dogs, Red and Badger, could hang out, and it was wonderful. And I was one of the few people who was there pretty much every day. My whole life revolved around sitting and the Sunday program. And it was great, and it was also my very first practice discussion with Kyoki. She said, why do you always bring something when you come? And I'm like, well, because you're just opening and you need lots of stuff. And she said, yeah. And then she just kept asking the same question again and again. And I'm like, okay, how many different ways do I have to answer this? And finally, I just kind of said, because if I just come without bringing something, I don't think that it's enough. I didn't think I was enough. And that was probably the first real insight I had with a teacher. And that was actually a pretty, I don't know whether to say daunting or humiliating or humbling, or maybe I'll just settle for great. It was great to learn that about myself. I'm going to take a moment here. Can you tell me what time it is?
11:20.
Okay. So, and we need to be done by 11:30. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Definitely.
Okay. So Kyoki, she knew me. She picked up on a lot. She picked up on the fact that I had a major teacher crush. Happens a lot, you know, happens with therapists. But I knew Kyoki was A, celibate, C, straight. So I had no problem with it. I knew it's one of those things, they happen, they pass, right? And then Nonan came to visit, and I could see that he didn't think much of me. And I could see that a lot of it had to do with the fact that he thought my practice was just about Kyoki. And I knew it wasn't, but I also could understand why he felt that way and why she might have felt that way. And at a certain point, she and I talked. And the upshot of it was she kicked me out. And I was not allowed to come back for 6 months. And she said, "You've done nothing wrong. And I know it isn't fair, but we are the only two people here most days. She said, that is a very difficult thing. How do you think you're ever going to get past this if we're in this very intimate situation where we're sitting together every day, we're working together every day? I mean, I didn't really think about it, I just was going to keep going. And she said, well, we can't. This isn't good, and it isn't. Basically, and I know she talked with Nona because she told me about it. She just said this, this is not tenable. We have to, one of us has to go. And she said, it can't be me. I'm the teacher here. She said, I know it's not fair. Because, of course, I wouldn't expect her to leave. But I will say that was probably one of the most difficult things I had to deal with early on in my practice, was losing my teacher, my place to practice, and the Sangha, all in one fell swoop for 6 months. And she said, you can go study with other teachers. And so in the end, I did. I left and I went to San Francisco Zen Center. And I met Tia Strozer, who had also been a student of Katagiri's. She was his Jisha when he died. She also knew Nat. And we connected. And when the same thing came up with her, she just immediately said, well, you have that energy with me too. And I said, well, yeah. I said, so what's the solution to that? Do I go with a male teacher? She said, you could, but she said you could also just deal with it. And because it was a big center with a lot of people, that was doable. And she just, anytime, she let me know, if you cross a line, you won't be able to stay. But as long as you stay aware of what you're doing, we're fine, And so when it came time for them to decide if I could stay as a resident, I said, so have I done any egregious things? That was Jeffrey, who was the director at the time. That was his word. And she said, no, you haven't. I said, you sound so surprised. And she said, well, actually, I guess I am. And I was a little bit annoyed, but because it was kind of like Kyoki and Nonan all over again. But on some level, I understood that why they felt that way, because I was a little old to be having crushes like that. But that was part of what I was still learning, was, intimacy comes in so many different forms, and some of us don't learn from our parents how to distinguish. So when you come into Zen from having nothing that is even remotely similar to what happens in practice discussion or Dokusan, you think it means something. And it does, but not what you think. Our first thing is to go for, depending on what kind of person you are, the romantic or the sexual. We're human beings, and the body does tell us a lot of what we need to know, so that's where we go. It took me a while to learn that wasn't always giving me the right information. The body was, yes, but I was interpreting it in a different way because of my limited understanding. And I was lucky to have two teachers who called me on it, and one who was willing to work through it with me because she had the capacity to do that, being in a big place with a lot of students and a lot of teachers. And so a couple years later, when Nat came to publicize one of her books at San Francisco Zen Center. We were having tea in the back of the dining room, and she looked at me and she said, I know I told you to focus on meditation. She said, I didn't think you were going to take it this far. So I think I'm going to end it there. I mean, obviously there's a lot more, but I think that's basically how I got to Zen, and a lot about my connection with this lineage. And I just, I'll leave it open for, how much time do we have for questions, if there is any time?
We got, I mean, it's 11:27, but.
Yeah.
Okay, so I just want to mention one thing. This is kind of a PS. It's not technically way-seeking mind stuff, but you may have noticed that I'm not wearing robes. This is the only robe I'm wearing. It's the only robe you will see me wearing is my rakusu. There's a lot more to this than what I'm going to say right now, and I can talk about it later, but basically my practice right now is finding out what it is to be a priest without all the robes, without all the, without having Ben Shuso, without having Dharma transmission. I've taken myself off that track. I made a choice at a certain point after talking with Tia. I just decided this is my way of being a priest, is being in the world and with people in a different way. My Dharma brother who was ordained with me, he's the abbot at San Francisco Zen Center, and he's grown into it beautifully. And I was so proud of him when I was there. It was like, damn, David, you did all right. Because he didn't lose himself in that process. He became more himself. And I respect that a lot. It isn't me. Because I see all those robes and I see how people are intimidated by them. And I remember watching all the priests troop up to the Kaisando after service and do another service with Suzuki Roshi. Well, not with Suzuki Roshi, with, in the Kaisando with his memorial thing. And my first year there, I was like, oh, so they figured out a way to get out of Soji. And that was what I took from that.
Soji, which is work practice.
Yeah, which is work practice after service. And I laughed because I know they all worked very hard. I knew that. But I also felt like there's constantly separation when you're in a big place like that, and sometimes even in a small place. And I didn't want that. I wanted to just be a priest who was sharing experience and spending time with people, and not I don't say anybody puts themselves on a pedestal, but I've seen some who do. I wanted to make sure that never happened, but I also wanted to see what it was like to do it that way instead of the other way. So, having said that I have not been Shuso or been transmitted, this means that I will not be doing Dokusan, practice discussion, whatever you want to call it, one-on-one. However, if you want to talk, come and have coffee or tea. Just let me know ahead of time so I'm sure to be here. I'm happy to do that. And I think we can just leave it at that for now, and then I'll just open it up for questions if you have any questions about anything. And also talk more about it all later, so.